Good afternoon, welcome to Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting, and I have today my colleague Ron Dart, and today we're going to be talking about the Canadian scene. You've noticed that once in a while we do a broadcast which we call the Canadian scene, and we're having a special celebration, I suppose, of one of Canada's foremost poets, a more political poet than anything else, Milton Acorn, and probably one of our more famous poets. We have a few volumes about Milton Acorn. We're going to discuss his life and his work a little. The one that we published here at St. Axis Press ourselves, Beyond Bethune, is Milton Acorn's metaphor for the Canadian fate, people's poetry. Many of you will know that Bethune was a doctor who worked in China for years and became a national hero there, and also very deeply respected in Canada. For some reason, Acorn chose him as a metaphor for the Canadian fate. In a springtime instant, one of collection of Milton Acorn's works, that's, I don't know when it was published, Ron can tell us, and a few others, Milton Acorn's, some of his poetry, and meditations, and biography of him. Ron, I remember Milton Acorn vaguely. At the time I wouldn't have known who he was from the Advanced Mattress Coffee House in Vancouver. Seems to have been his British Columbia headquarters. And I remember him as being a bit of a idiosyncratic person, as poets I suppose are wont to be. But you want to explain to us the place of Milton Acorn in Canadian letters, say something about it?
Well, probably one of the first things we should recognize is that this book from Mosaic Press, Milton Acorn in a Springtime Instant, has just come out. Mm-hmm. It brings together, James Deal has done an excellent job in selecting really the gold from Acorn's poetry and given a nice chronological overview of some of those key works of political poetry, religious poetry, nature poetry, which have had a profound impact on the whole Canadian literary scene. So there is a bit of a renaissance going on right now of Milton Acorn, and this book just came out. There's a magazine which is going to come out this year or next, which is devoted to Acorn, and then Mosaic Press next year is going to do a book on the critical essays on Acorn. So we're in the midst of a very important period right now in reviving Milton Acorn. You were mentioning Vancouver, where perhaps you met him. He was out here for 1963 to 1968, and one of the magazines at that time on the West Coast was Georgia Strait, at that time sort of an iconoclastic magazine. It's now become a more iconographic for many of the West Coast people. It's become quite establishment. But Milton Acorn was right there at the founding of Georgia Strait. He broke from Georgia Strait because he felt its excessive anarchism was something he could not hold to. And Acorn is probably one of the finest, what we would call red Tory poets in Canada. If George Grant is the preeminent philosophic, political red Tory, Milton Acorn is the sort of the epitome of poetic red Toryism. And so these three works, which are coming out in a Springtime Instant, edited by James Deal. Terry Barker really is very important in that. It was Terry Barker's early work after Acorn, Meditations on the Message of Canada's People's Poet.
Yeah, and Terry Barker was also the author of Beyond Bethune, the people's poetry of Milton Acorn. So Terry Barker figures prominently in our modern literary sphere, and particularly with his focus on Milton Acorn.
Very, very much so. Just to give perhaps the dates of Milton Acorn, he was born in 1923, died in 1986, and so that sets him in a very important period of Canadian literary political history. He hobnobbed with most of the major Canadian poets. He was born in the Maritimes, then moved to Montreal, Toronto, and then, as I mentioned earlier, he was on the West Coast here from 1963 to 1968. He was very concerned with what was going on in the West Coast in terms of the rise of anarchism politically, and a form of the Americanization of Canadian poetry, largely through through the Beats and Black Mountain Poets, and he was trying to bring to Canada a sense of great nationalist poetry, and he was very worried by the what we would call the colonization of the Canadian mind, the colonization of the Canadian literary mind, which he saw being epitomized on the West Coast, and some of the things going on here in Georgia Strait was a part of that.
I remember the founding of Georgia Strait, and some of us had discussed it at the University of British Columbia, Maria included. It seemed that a lot of the anarchism came from San Francisco or California. And the Canadian left was never comfortable with anarchism. We still believe in peace, order, and good government. And that anarchism was something that was very prominent. Actually, the Georgia Strait was extraordinarily vulgar when it first came out as well. And a lot of people were opposed to it. Now, would you perhaps let me suggest that Milton Acorn is the poetic version of Lament for a Nation?
Very, very much so. And his work, I've Tasted My Blood, which there was a great clash amongst the Canadian literary elite in 1970 when the Governor General award was given out, and many thought Milton Acorn was going to win it for I've Tasted My Blood. And what happened was, in fact, one of the students of one of the leading anarchist professors at British Columbia, he ended up winning it, George Bowring, who become our poet laureate. And so what was created in Canada was the People's Poet Award in 1970, which Milton Acorn was given for I've Tasted My Blood, which, as you say, was really the poetic equivalent of Grant's political manifesto, Lament for a Nation.
That's what I've always sort of tied the two of them together in a way because of that. And Lament for a Nation came out in an era when Milton Acorn was really flourishing here in British Columbia. But the two of them were looking at, I suppose, what you'd call the death of Canadian nationalism, in a way, or the waning of Canadian nationalism.
Yeah, very much so, and they were very concerned with the colonization of the Canadian imagination, the Canadian mind, and this rise of poetic nationalism, of which Acorn rode the crest of in many ways with I've Tasted My Blood. He went on to win later the Governor General's Award for Poetry. And so he was, you were mentioning George Grant. James Deal, who lived with Milton Acorn in Toronto, said, in the latter years of Acorn's life, he constantly was talking about George Grant and C.S. Lewis, and George Grant was profoundly influenced by C.S. Lewis. And so what's quite interesting, I think, in both James Deal's introduction and Terry Barker's earlier work in 1999, is that both of them have emphasized, more than other biographies like Chris Gudgeon or Richard Lem here, is that Acorn was very much a red Tory, and also he was very grounded in the Anglican the high church tradition. And many of the early biographers of Acorn have ignored his deep religious rooting in maritime high church Anglicanism, and also ignored the fact he was not a Marxist, he was a red Tory. He was, interesting enough, given an honorary doctorate with John Diefenbaker, who was the great rogue Tory Prime Minister of Canada.
And I'll ask you, Milton Acorn had one favorite political poet that he thought was ahead of everybody else. Can you tell us who that was?
Well, you'll have to tell me.
No, the crown prince of Canadian political poets.
Oh, Robin Matthews, of course, yes. Yeah.
Robin Matthews, a very dear friend to both of us, and I think Robin Matthews is one of the most unfortunately ignored Canadian poets. But it was he and James Steele who led the charge to have re-Canadianized Canadian universities.
Very much so.
And really, it was Robin Matthews and Steele spearheaded that, had a huge impact on it. And Robin was very highly respected by Milton Acorn, in fact, as a poet.
Oh yes, and Milton Acorn wrote a splendid introduction to one of Robin's book of poetry, arguing that if people had to look back and see who are the great political poets, that Matthews would stand heads and shoulders above any of them. There's an amazing introduction. Acorn tended not to write in laudatory terms about a lot of Canadian poets, but Robin Matthews, he did so. And so there's this very close connection between Milton Acorn, Robin Matthews, and George Grant as key political, poetic, literary thinkers in Canada who embody the best of that, what we would call red Tory tradition.
Yeah, I would say if one wanted really to go into the red Tory tradition itself, and it's important because Canada was founded on the red Tory basis. It really was the high Anglican red Tory sensitivities that really kind of shaped the country, and people misunderstand the term red Tory simply because of reds. And you know, I often think of how we call it Red Square, but actually in Russian it's Beautiful Square. But the word red and beautiful are the same in Russian. So people began to identify Red Square in Moscow with the communists. Of course, it had nothing to do with that. It was the Beautiful Square long before. And when we talk about red Tories, people always think of something, you know, very left-wing or something. But in fact, it's something that was spiritually rooted in High Church Anglicanism. And it was also rooted in the sense of commonweal, rather than radical individualism. And you yourself have done quite a bit of writing on the subject, and I think probably your work should be more broadly read as well. In the red Tory tradition, for one who wants to understand the Canadian ethos, certainly Milton Acorn, Grant, and Robin Matthews are integral parts of the Canadian ethos itself and of giving voice to it. And I'd like to think that also Terry Barker, I think, is very undervalued. I think Terry Barker should be much more well-known and much more respected in the field himself.
Oh, Terry Barker has done an amazing job, like in After Acorn, Meditations on the Message of Canada's People's Poet, and then his work on Beyond Bethune. He and James Deal, I think, have played a substantive role in furthering the understanding of Canadian red Toryism, in publishing works on this. James Deal himself is a fine, fine poet, stands in the line and lineage of Acorn himself. Terry Barker, very much philosophically grounded in that tradition. So there's this constellation of philosophical people, poetic people, who are bringing together this red Tory tradition again, and in many ways, in a springtime instance, selected poems of Milton Acorn, which is edited by James. And I might add, his introduction is a wonderful overview of Acorn's life, his writings, the various genres that he approached in poetry, the themes he dealt with. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a more comprehensive understanding of Acorn that includes his political red Toryism, which some of these earlier biographers confused with Marxism or leftist thought. Acorn was more nuanced, and then Acorn's rootings are deeply religious in High Church Anglicanism, of which the Maritimes, that was a vital part of maritime religious life, of which Acorn took in with his mother's milk in many ways.
Yeah, I think the spiritual or religious dimension of Acorn is often completely missed, and like so many figures in philosophy and poetry, he was misunderstood and misinterpreted by people who really didn't look at any depth at the man and what he was doing and what he was writing. And I think that hopefully that will be remedied as this sort of re-celebration of Milton Acorn's life unfolds. And I want to say, I'm going to embarrass my guest now and say that no study of the Canadian ethos and red Toryism would be complete if one hasn't read Ron Dart and his works in it, because my colleague here is I think, one of the most significant red Tory philosophers in Canada today, and has written a great deal about it and resuscitated the remembrance of some almost forgotten Canadian authors and figures. And so I think I would have to class you in this whole set.
Oh, I merely stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before.
Well, don't we all?
Yes.
Really, thank God there's some shoulders we can stand on.
Yes.
But anyway, I want to invite people to look, particularly in this particular, in this time when Milton Acorn is beginning to be more completely appreciated, to take a look at Acorn and his poetry, but also the philosophy that permeates his poetry, because it says a great deal about what shaped and formed Canada and what made it the country that it is today. We often forget the figures like John Diefenbaker, who was certainly an irascible and could be quite an unpleasant man when you crossed him, but at the same time, the gift that he gave to Canada during the time when he was Prime Minister, for example, bringing the First Nations people into the flow of Canadian society and culture and recognizing them as equal human beings, giving them the vote, and the fact that he really had a deep reverence for justice, Diefenbaker.
Oh, very much.
And, to look at the story of his life as well. But to remember that these poets were giving another dimension to what some of the great writers, like George Grant and others, were giving us in prose. And I hope that we'll see a lot of interest, academic interest at least, in Milton Acorn now.
One of Acorn's interesting short stories is called The Red and Green Pony, done probably in the 1950s. And I mean, long before Greenpeace came along in the late 1960s, there was a growing interest in environmental concerns. Milton Acorn had brought together red and green, and this comes much later. So in one sense, he's very much on the cutting edge, a decade before our time, in terms of being alert to the fact that we were about to face some serious ecological issues.
Yeah.
Most people think Tory or conservative, they think insensitivity to the environment. This classical red Tories, in fact, was way ahead of its times in being alert, antenna out to what was about to happen to the environment. And Acorn's short story, Red and Green Pony, I think should be read by everyone in Canada because it was prophetic-like. A decade or more ahead of its time in linking red and green.
Yeah, how available is that book, I wonder? It would be very important to find out how available it is and suggest that some of our university professors and people use that as a to give it to some of the students for thesis or some.
Well, it's in I've Tasted My Blood. Most of I've Tasted My Blood, which was given the People's Poet Award in 1970. Mostly poetry, but there's two short stories in that, and one is The Red and Green Pony, and I think that short story should be in the anthologies of all Canadian works of poetry, of prose, because Acorn was way ahead of his time in having a sensitivity to what was coming down the pike that we were going to have to face in our time. Yeah. And here he was, a Tory, red and green, when most people think conservatives are the farthest thing from both red and green, and he was already synthesizing these in a poetic way in the 1950s and 60s.
I think too, I'd like to see a little bit of distance or space between the concept of modern conservatives and Tory, because the conservatives we have today are 19th century liberals. They're not Tories at all.
In no sense.
They really are 19th century liberals trying to reinstitute 19th century liberalism, and the problem of laissez-faire that almost collapsed the American economy in 2009. And it was really that laissez-faire attitude, that deregulation, that created the economic crisis in the States.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I mean, this is why, Acorn, George Grant, Diefenbaker, that's a very different type of conservatism than Stephen Harper.
Yeah,
and I'm sure, well, I know Acorn or Grant's stomach would turn over, when facing people like Stephen Harper and the Conservative Party today. They're just conserving sort of laissez-faire liberalism, which is very different from historic Canadian conservatism.
Yeah, it's one of the ironies, I think, that what passes as modern conservatism is really just a revisitation of 19th century liberalism. And that's something that kind of poisons the understanding. And it's nice to see that we can resuscitate that in some ways. I hope we'll see a few things coming out of universities now about Acorn, as a philosopher and a poet, both.
Yeah, very much so. And what we haven't talked about is that Acorn himself drew deeply from key Canadian political poets, many of our Confederation poets, and he stood on the shoulders of other leading Canadian poets before him who were very political. And sadly so, there's been a fragment in poetry between a much more aesthetic approach to poetry, which has lopped off the political dimensions of poetry, and people like Milton Acorn and Robin Matthews are standing within a line and lineage of Canadian thought, which sees the role of poetry as having a political conscience.
Well, we should see a resuscitation of the works of Robin Matthews as well, and more interest in him as a philosopher and poet, and as a person you don't want to be on the bad side of as well. But we have too many of our people who are sort of forgotten or sort of overshadowed by other things, and yet they're really at the roots and foundation of what we try to maintain in the Canadian ethos, and try to recover when it's been dampened down. And hoping that we'll swing back toward Toryism away from the neoconservatism at some point. But people have to know what that is.
Very much. And the publishing of Milton Acorn in a springtime instant, who knows, it would be nice if we did have this shift in a springtime instant from conservatism of Harper and Tribe. But the publication of In a Springtime Instant, and then this magazine Ambassador, which is going to be a collected work of essays on Acorn, and then the follow-up book from Mosaic Press of critical essays on Acorn, I think is going to play a significant role, not only in the revival of Acorn, but also the renewal of Toryism, or high church, high Toryism, red Toryism in Canada, and a more comprehensive and honest view of Acorn is a part of that process.
Yeah. The thing I'd like to suggest people interested in following through, look for the books of Ron Dart on red Toryism, or high Toryism as well. And look for anything by Terry Barker, because Terry Barker is an important person in Canadian letters today, and undervalued, not nearly as well known as he should be. But Terry Barker and Beyond Bethune, I think a marvelous study on the poetry and philosophy of Milton Acorn. And I think something, quite an important book, as the others are. And Neil...
I'd also say Terry's book on After Acorn, Meditations on the Message of Canada's People's Poet. These are nice companion books by Terry Barker.
Hopefully we'll hear more from Terry in the future. And more about Robin Matthews as well. I think that's something that has to come. And I think we have to get more academic interest in Robin Matthews and his work, and see reproductions of, republishing of some of his works. I understand you took up something that I had to drop some time ago because of illness and all, on something of a biography of Robin. Are you trying to work on something like that?
Present time I'm not, but I've done a variety of essays, and I'd love to, if I have the time sometimes, bring my essays together, because I have a whole whack of them on Robin, and then I have a whole bunch on Milton Acorn, and some on Dorothy Livesay. And I think there's a nice tradition through Dorothy Livesay, Milton Acorn, Robin Matthews, and there's a variety of good political poets in Canada that there is no book that brings them all together in a nice volume that the Canadian people then can read and say, oh, there's a form of political poetry here that we need to once again remember and return to understand the Canadian soul.
Yeah, I think Livesay is also someone who deserves more attention than she's gotten in recent times, That, if anybody can bring that together in a single volume, it's probably Ron Dart. And I rather hope that you'll find time to do it.
Another one I would say would be Maria Fiamingo.
Oh, of course, yes, Maria.
A book of her collective poems came out a few years ago. And she's another great Canadian poet, stands in a class of her own as a red Tory poet. And so there's this family of poets in Canada.
She taught at UBC when I was there.
Oh, did she? Yes, that's right. She was there for a couple of decades.
She was. And quite interesting, she was also one of the opponents of the rise of anarchism in it. in that whole movement of that period of time that was going on. So, and she's still with us, I believe.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, she's in her 80s.
Yeah.
Doesn't have the strength, the feisty strength she once had.
No, she certainly had feisty strength. Yeah,
Yes.
she did.
Yeah.
But anyway, I thank you for joining us for this broadcast and sharing with us about Milton Acorn. And he was one of these unusual personalities that, you know, when you're really, really creative, and he certainly was a very creative person, there are other things that in a way kind of endear you to the person because of they're outside the box. And Milton Acorn was definitely outside the box.
Oh, no doubt about that.
I remember him at the Advanced Mattress Coffee House when he thought people weren't listening as attentively as they should have when he was reading poetry, turning and reading to the wall and quipping that the wall at least had intelligence. So I wish I had gotten to know him really better personally. So we've been talking about one of the great Canadian Red Tory poets, Milton Acorn, but also I think we have to look at him as a philosopher. His poetry certainly is full of the Red Tory philosophy and understandings of the world around him, but also spiritual. He was a religious person, and he stands in the political tradition of people like George Grant. And when we see some of the later poetry of Milton Acorn from the late 60s, we're immediately drawn to George Grant's famous Lament for a Nation, both of them in the tradition of Canadian nationalism and trying to preserve the Red Tory traditions, that is the sense of commonweal and the sense of unity and oneness upon which Canada was founded, not radical individualism, but the common good, the commonweal itself. And we can see that even in the Canadian Constitution, where the preamble says to establish peace, order, and good government. That this is talking about the nation as a whole, not what the individual might use the nation for, but what we as a people should share equally amongst ourselves in a sense of social justice. And Milton Acorn was certainly interested in social justice in it. So thank you very much for joining us, Ron. And I really appreciate this opportunity to reflect on Milton Acorn and his work, and to welcome in, or to help usher in, this renaissance and interest in Milton Acorn. So thank you very much for joining us, and look for some of these books that we've talked about today. The Beyond Bethune, and Springtime Instant, in particular, Springtime Instant's a new work, and done by somebody who knew Milton Acorn rather intimately, and Terry Barker's works, because Terry Barker himself is a very important person in Canadian matters. So thank you again for joining us, and please let us hear from you about these broadcasts. The Canadian scene is rather different than most of our broadcasts, and it has a unique focus on things Canadian. So we'd like to hear from you and your opinions and your points of view about these broadcasts.